Hello, everyone.
Good evening, everyone.
Are we live?
Hi. Okay, hi everyone. So we are going to start. We'll start first with a short introduction by the chair, McLean Clutter, and then we will do a kind of digital walkthrough and show you some of the work that we've been working on. So let's get McLean on here.
I'm here.
All right.
Hello.
We good?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, hello, everyone out there. Welcome to the very first all virtual Taubman College Fellowship presentation and exhibition opening. I'm McLean Clutter, the chair of the architecture program here at Taubman College. And I'm really delighted to be giving this introduction and to have the opportunity to introduce the work of the fellows despite the context. So those of us who have been at the college at Taubman for quite a while know that one recurrent characteristic of our fellows is that they have the ability to complete projects with a kind of richness, level of consideration, and intellectual depth that seem like they could have taken years to pull off, all within the context of 1 year. So it probably shouldn't be a surprise that with the onslaught of the coronavirus pandemic, Eduardo, Jacob, and Mattis were able to turn on a dime to reconceptualize their fellowship exhibition opening, and then to reconceptualize it a second time as the situation continued to develop, and to still deliver this event tonight in a pretty impressive fashion. So on behalf of the architecture program, I want to start by thanking them. I think we need this kind of thing right now more than ever, and you guys have made the college proud. So the fellowships at Taubman College are among our most cherished traditions. Every year for more than 30 years now, we've brought in a set of some of the most talented young architects, designers, and scholars to teach and pursue a 1-year project within the context of our school. There are more than 100 alumni of our fellowships spread all over the country and the world. And some are among the most accomplished architects, designers, and thought leaders in our fields. And of course, many are now tenured or tenure track faculty here at Taubman. I think the fellows are absolutely essential to the ecology of the architecture program here, to kind of sustaining the dynamism and experimental spirit that I think defines us at our best. While the fellows are amongst the most junior of our faculty, at the same time, and perhaps in a bit of a strange way, I've always viewed them as kinds of leaders of the faculty. We look to the fellows to guide us towards new ideas and methods, to keep us fresh, to challenge us, and to cause us to question habits of thought that may have become too routinized or automatic. And while we as a college take the responsibility of mentoring our fellows very seriously, I think we also learn and expand our breadth and depth of knowledge from their presence. So just a few examples. The first time I heard the word Anthropocene, it was from a fellow. I learned to see the picturesque tradition and architecture anew from a fellow. I learned about Walmart's territorializing command on urbanization from a fellow. I actually started to pay attention to the discursive capacities of Instagram and architecture culture because of a fellow. I learned about little known histories of computational aesthetics from a fellow. And this list could really go on and on. I also had a former fellow as a professor. I worked for a former fellow, and now I practice with a former fellow. My point here is I don't think my experience is unique. Taubman Fellows have been profoundly impactful on the work and thought of many of us in the college and in the discipline at large. I love that the work of our fellows, frankly, doesn't always make sense. Sometimes it's too close to our disciplinary threshold of known aesthetic tendencies or utterable thoughts to bother with sense on that level. It always makes sense later, once the rest of us have kind of caught up, and once the fellows figure out what it is that they were working on when they made the work. And I love that we as an architecture program support that kind of experimentation and risk. I think it makes us unique as an institution. And I think that kind of venturing into the unknown is absolutely central to academic pursuit. And if Taubman Fellows so often direct us towards nascent topics and techniques, or those of emerging urgency, then these three this year seem no different. Given the context and format for tonight's event, Jacob, Mattis, and Eduardo seem like nothing less than proverbial canaries in the coal mine. Skimming through their project statements, they ask us to think about things like architecture's entanglement with the immaterial, with digital interfaces and spreadsheets. They discuss the convergence of places of work, life, and leisure. They throw caution at the precarity of free market capitalism. They allude to a condition of, quote, digital nomadism, a term that must resonate with so many of us who have found ourselves wandering through various formats of remote digital collaboration and work for these past couple of weeks. And there are more tropes like this that I'm sure that they will unpack in much more detail for you. But to be clear, the present crisis is not the topic of these fellows' projects, but it's certainly revealing of the relevance of our work, that our response to the crisis brings so many of their key concepts into sharp relief. So I won't be a spoiler. I'll leave the content stuff there, but I'll conclude just by introducing the fellows in the order that they'll present, and then I'll hand it over to them. So first, we'll hear from Mattis Gross-Kaufmannis. He is our Sanders Fellow here at Taubman College. His research and design work examines architecture's relationship to political and economic ideologies, with a focus on the emergence of global architecture practice. In 2018, he served as a curator of the Latvian Pavilion at the Venice Architectural Biennale, exploring housing as a means of nation building. He's an alum of the Stroka Institute for Media Architecture and Design in Moscow, and also he holds a master's degree from Delft University of Technology and a bachelor's degree from the Glasgow School of Art. And prior to founding his architecture agency Schema in 2019, Gross-Kaufmannis worked on research, publishing, and building projects as part of the practices OMA and MVRDB. Next, we'll hear from Jacob Commercy. Jacob is a designer and educator, and he's this year's William Muschenheim Fellow here at Taubman. Jacob received a Master's of Architecture from Princeton University and a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from the University of Illinois at Chicago. While at Princeton, he was awarded the Howard Crosby Butler Traveling Fellowship, where he studied building groups in Berlin, as well as the Suzanne Kollerick Underwood Thesis Prize for Excellence in Design. And he's worked for offices like Bureau Spectacular in Chicago and Los Angeles, and for Moss and LTL in New York. His research and design work considers models for collective life and work by way of the interior fit out of existing real estate with furniture scale domestic equipment. And then finally tonight, we'll hear from Eduardo Mediero. Eduardo is the inaugural Fishman Fellow here at Taubman College, a new fellowship named in recognition of our own Professor Robert Fishman, who I assume is at home watching this right now. Mediero is a licensed architect and founder of Hanger, an architecture practice based in Madrid that works on the confluence of architectural precedents and financial organizational models. The practice develops projects from furniture, interior design, housing, and urbanism. Mediero holds a Master's of Architecture with honors from the Polytechnic University of Madrid and a Master's of Architecture from Harvard's GSD, where he was the recipient of the 2018 KPF Traveling Fellowship. His work has been exhibited at the 14th Biennial of Spanish Architecture and Urbanism, the 16th and 15th Venice Biennale, the Colegio de Arquitectos de Madrid, and at ETSM. Mediero is the recipient of the Real Colegio Complutense Fellowship and the Arthur Lehman Fund. So with that, maybe we can all clap to ourselves in whatever rooms that we're in right now, and let's welcome the Taubman Fellows, starting with Mattis.
Well.
Great. Thank you, McLean. That was great. We are
Maybe before Marius goes on the a kind of overall project description, we will have a few words that we want to say collectively, and we have kind of delegated that to Eduardo Medero to deliver.
Yeah, and we are also going to be showing a sort of video walkthrough of the space, so that you guys can also check that out. Cool. Should we wait for that?
Just a second. So we actually managed to build an exhibition in the real space, which unfortunately you could not see IRL. But our plan is to show you a walkthrough, and Eduardo will explain it.
Sure. Well, first of all, we'd like to also thank Dean Massey and the chairs of the Architecture and Urban Planning Department for their unconditional support, and of course, very especially to McLean Clutter for his help and enthusiasm from the very beginning. We'd also like to thank our respective fellowship selection committees for granting us this amazing opportunity, and to the faculty and staff of the Liberty Research Annex Gallery, which you guys will see it here in the video. We're actually entering it right now. And to Chris Humphrey, whose assistance has been incredible in the making of this exhibition, and Sam Wood for a great visual identity and graphic design. And maybe also remind everyone that we have a chat box in the YouTube link where you all will be able to make comments or ask questions that we'll be able to answer after our talks. So what you're seeing here in this video is as Mats was saying, the physical exhibition that is currently right now at the Liberty Research Annex Gallery, and that we hope that you will be able to visit in person one day. And this exhibition that we titled Practice Product Protocol is an exhibition about architecture's entanglement with immaterial systems, as McLean was mentioning. So in the era of the information economy, an increasing part of architectural discourse no longer responds to material assets, but rather to the value and opportunity of intangible ones, such as financial instruments, digital interfaces, spreadsheets, invoices, and diagrams. The emergence of abstract organizational structures has also led to the inability of establishing clear boundaries between traditional notions of public and private space, as domestic and working environments have converged into a single place of life, work, and leisure. Increasingly, these environments are mediated through corporate organizational platforms, allocating space as a subscription-based service. The entanglement of architecture with these immaterial systems is displayed in this exhibition in 3 interspersed parts, ranging from a serially produced catalog of deployable soft architecture, a video game environment that examines organizational models of architecture practice, and financial formations for a post-property urban condition. So right now, what we're seeing here is sort of the walkthrough of the video, and we'll let you guys sort of check it out, see it virtually before we start.
Yeah, so as you see for this year, with the great support of McLean, we managed to kind of try to organize the exhibition in a space that is not part of the kind of faculty building, but it's outside of the building. And the idea was to kind of bring everyone just to another place. And now, because of the virus, everyone else is kind of distributed in their homes. So that plan did not work, but nonetheless, I think it's important to mention that we basically we were given a lot of physical space to fill, and also a lot of support in a way to do that. So in this video, you are kind of seeing the kind of gradual full walkthrough of everything that we have physically produced over the last academic years. So you see a lot of furniture pieces, architectural models. There's like a video game. There are actually 2 video games. One is a well-known video game. Other one is not that well-known video game. And we're gonna talk about it in a minute. This video was also kind of filmed during the daytime. So the kind of original intention was to kind of also work on the lighting and to kind of set the kind of set mood that we could all collectively try to imagine what it could be. But the overall kind of like overarching theme on this space is just the kind of like a scattering of different objects in more or less kind of a random manner. To basically produce like a labyrinth of large-scale architectural models. And yeah, as you see in the video, that's pretty much how it looks like. Jacob, you want to add something?
Yeah, just that. Well, to echo the thanks of to McLean for being very supportive throughout in all the ways and just encouraging us the entire time. There was never a point when in our musings that he discouraged us. So I can't thank him enough. And also just the point that we were as a kind of, we understood the fellowship not as 3 individual projects, although of course we all made individual things, but the practice product protocol idea, I would say, I mean, if I were to speak for these guys, as well as myself, that none of us identify with just one of those terms, and that I think those terms will be present, they'll be visibly present in the work that you'll see. So yeah, no, I don't have anything else to say. It's great. So maybe we can, excuse me. I wish you guys could see this. I guess that's the other thing I would say. I wish you guys could see, but I'm glad that whoever the 150 something people that are here are interested in seeing it.
Yeah, and here on this white wall, you would ideally see a video game that was not projected at that moment. Anyway, and that's the end of the walkthrough. So our plan, as McLean kind of indicated, is basically going to have like a sequence of 3 presentations. I'll start first, then Jacob will follow, and then it will be concluded by Eduardo. After that, we're going to have a response, a discussion about our work by 3 faculty members who we invited to kind of look at our work and also to kind of maintain a discussion. However, those who are watching this on YouTube, I would invite you to kind of prepare questions and just type them in the chat box. All 3 of us are monitoring the chat box. And in the end, we will try to kind of also organize some kind of, we will experiment with a Q&A from YouTube to just try to answer maybe some questions that you might have as well. Right. So on that note, I'll start with my project. So just a second. Right. Right. All right, we are live. Okay, so and basically my presentation consists of 2 parts. I will start with a very brief kind of overview of things that I've looked at over the last academic year during my fellowship. And then in the second half of my presentation, I will try to basically kind of show what are the things that I actually made physically for the exhibition. So there'll be 2 parts. Before I continue, there are 2 notes that I wish to kind of in a way, kind of include in my presentation. So one is that to keep this live stream kind of lively and concise, I will glance many things that I would love to talk about more in another occasion. So if you want to reach out to me and just like, I don't know, talk about these things, let's do that. Second thing is that before I continue, I really need to thank a significant amount of people without whom this project and this fellowship would never have happened. And in particular, I want to thank McLean Clutter, who, as mentioned before, kind of gave us this kind of unconditional support for the fellowship, which we really appreciate. This was kind of really kind of fresh sense of kind of really kind of liberating conditions that we were kind of granted, and that's really kind of that's something unique, and I personally really appreciate that. And also I wanted to thank McLean for this kind of continuous encouragement to kind of truly explore things in my work without the kind of obligation of being intellectually accountable for what I've done during the exhibition opening, which is tonight. I also want to thank the last year's fellowship committee for choosing me, and I guess in particular also Sharon Har, who was at that time head of the school, who kind of hired me. But also more importantly, I got to work with Sharon, and she kind of really kind of helped me to transition from practice to this kind of world of Taubman College during the first months when we were teaching together. And last but not least, I really want to thank the students who kindly agreed to collaborate with me on this project. Gary Zhang, Lindsay Barranco, and Catherine Mallory. Most of what you will see in the following slides, and both in the real kind of gallery space, if you ever get to see it, is a direct result of their kind of dedication, and it would not be there if they would not kind of have decided to help me. So I really appreciate that. All right. So practice product protocol. This is the name of our exhibition, and in a way, we kind of compiled this name based on our shared interests in the beginning of the kind of current academic year. In the beginning, they seemed like three very different interests, despite the fact that they all started with P. But then gradually these three topics kind of converged into a single exhibition and kind of also more importantly, a single ongoing discussion about architecture and what does it mean to practice architecture today? What's the point of it? What can we do realistically? What makes sense? And also maybe what we should look forward to. And it was an incredibly kind of productive discussion that I incredibly kind of appreciate. This was a really amazing set of fellows that I was so privileged to work together with. So I think that what we will see tonight, namely the kind of domestic simulations, financial formations, as well as managerial hallucinations, is a result of our kind of ongoing discussion throughout the last months. Right, however, let's get specific. So my part is practice. I was in practice before coming to Taubman College, but it's also a topic that has been kind of like preoccupying me for a long time, especially in the context of kind of political and economic ideologies and different regimes. I think as much as architects are interested in all kinds of things, we should also be interested in our own practice and the way that we kind of organize and plan our practice, because obviously there are more and more kind of, I see pressures for architects to kind of perform and to shape their practice and according to different demands. So I started my fellowship with a broader hypothesis that there are kind of broader shifts in economy that have significantly altered the face of architectural practice today, and that in a way management of operations in the practice have taken increasingly kind of important role in architectural thinking. Instead of, let's say, some kind of other profound engagement with culture, politics, even design in a way. So I spent my fellowship in a way to investigate this and to see how much of my hypothesis can be verified or not. I suspect that every major crisis in the world it changes the face of architecture. So did the 2008 crisis. And probably the ones that we're going through right now will change architecture too in some way. And on a general note, I hope that we can collectively start to kind of have discussions about what it is going to be already now, and to see where this is going, because I think it's important not to lose sight of the future, which, even though it feels like it's canceled, it will come in one way or another. So the image that you see comes from one of the well-known architectural practices operating today. And in my view, the kind of list of adjectives in this kind of very concise manifesto reflects a kind of broader temperament in architecture that is in a way needed to succeed in the kind of today's marketplace, to do any substantial kind of work. So in a way, you have to attempt to please everyone, tick all the boxes, say yes to everything, and maintain some kind of a disguise of a like unconditionally positive agent of change. And in a way, I think that's something that is kind of maybe seems very obvious nowadays, but I still find it kind of strange, because at least the way that I was educated is that architecture was always supposed to kind of engage in some kind of positive way without that kind of superficial statement. So so in a way, to kind of tick all the boxes in a way nowadays, to kind of be to be competitive in the architectural marketplace, I think it seems to me that in architecture, one needs much more than just the design ability, but rather some kind of managerial capacity. So for instance, management of projects, management of people, management of business, and management of finances. So by some accounts, the kind of roots of architectural management as a kind of discipline can be traced back to the 1960s, when the kind of first books devoted to the management were kind of published. However, on the broad scale, the architecture, engineering, and construction kind of industries probably started to kind of really adopt these kind of ideas that they need to manage themselves more as a business. Probably came a few decades later, probably partially in a kind of response to this, changing procurement methods, where kind of engineers and larger companies and all kinds of bureaucrats could kind of take a kind of bigger role. And I think probably one of the kind of greatest acknowledgements by just looking at what's been written in terms of theory about architectural management and management of architectural practice is the acknowledgement that most of architectural labor and is immaterial, and it cannot be subjected to some kind of inventory management. So therefore, running a practice becomes a kind of really careful balancing act between kind of immediate demand and supply of architectural services. And nowadays, there is kind of a really wide array of both material and immaterial technologies to support this process. So this kind of insights, if you will, is not unlike what we can find also in the kind of lineages of business management theory, right? And I really try to kind of spend some time to also look at, where are all these like ideas that like suddenly we have to kind of try to organize our practice according to some business principles. I mean, where is all that coming from in a way? And of course, there are big architectural corporations over the 20th century that we know. But then we see that more and more these ideas are kind of like gradually being absorbed into a broader set of practices that are not just these large corporations. So, and in fact, so I spent a lot of time looking at just trying to understand for myself the kind of history of business management, and where did all these ideas about how to organize your operations really come from? And then there's a really interesting broad array of thinkers from, I don't know, Peter Drucker to John Roberts, or from Frederick Winslow Taylor to Mary Parker Follett, and so on, who have all kind of contributed to this kind of gradual emergence of management theory, starting from the late 19th century to the present day. And in context of that, I think it's what's important to mention tonight is, and also in the context of architectural practice and management of architectural practice, I think the work by Lillian and Frank Gilbreth is particularly kind of interesting. So Lillian was a psychologist and Frank was a bricklayer, and together as a couple, they kind of turned to be incredibly influential in the kind of early management theory. What's interesting is that they really have this like spatial means of analyzing productivity of labor. They conducted this kind of well-known fatigue studies, and in their theory, they try to kind of categorize the kind of fatigue that is useful and the kind of fatigue that is not useful, and they built all kinds of machines and technologies to kind of measure the fatigue and to measure the efficiency of motion. And efficiency of motion, or let's say the elimination of waste motion, is at the basis of kind of any kind of capitalist kind of optimization of a company from early 20th century up to today. If you look at what, let's say, kind of Toyota production systems that are still at play today, it's still about like constant improvement and reduction of a kind of waste motion, reduction of unnecessary excess. A small note here, what we can see now with the kind of crisis of supply chains during the kind of global pandemic is that many of those ideas of optimization actually have proven to be kind of not that viable in a time of crisis, but again, we'll talk about it later. Yeah, so I think that going back to Gilbreth's, I think what's interesting is that it's not only the way that they measured effectivity of work, but also in a way I found fascinating to look at their work and their kind of prototypes of all kinds of technologies to boost worker productivity. And they did a lot. They have all kinds of like physical product-based kind of inventions, intended to kind of make workers more effective and also kind of more satisfied with their lives. So on the left side, you see kind of motion-studied desk that was designed ostensibly for a white-collar worker. And that was basically like kind of organized in a way that kind of there will be as little as possible waste motion when using that table when working there. On the right, even better, what I found fascinating is the kind of so-called one motion pencil rack. And also the pencil rack was intended to kind of like reduce any waste motion. So you would need to make only one motion to pick up the pencil from the desk. And in a way, I mean, if you really kind of extrapolate and go a few decades down this kind of lineage, we see that, I mean, one of the kind of insights or kind of premises under which I developed my project was that, in a way, the kind of management of architectural practice, and you can apply it to many service-driven enterprises in a way, they are rooted in this kind of like both immaterial as well as material technologies of management. So in a way, you know, the kind of optimization of work and workers and processes kind of is both something that you do in terms of like kind of immaterial abstract scheming of how to run things, but also in a way thinking of what kind of inventory you need to kind of make those operations possible. So, and I think that when we think about the kind of convergence of, you know, the kind of history of business management theory and the ideas how to keep optimizing business perpetually, so there will be less and less waste and more profit, less and less expense, more and more revenue. You know, and the architectural world, I think that there are quite a few interesting contact points. And in a way, we can see that this was one of the interesting reports that I found from McKinsey & Company. McKinsey & Company, for those who might not know it, is one of the kind of world's leading kind of, or largest or most elite business consultancy, who basically kind of come into large companies and they try to kind of fix and optimize their businesses and solve problems, existent or non-existent. Also, I need to note here that in some of today's architectural practices that we might know about, especially the large ones, there are people who, in a way, kind of really have kind of worked in this kind of business consulting in industries. And again, it's not a new thing. We can look at SOM or whatever. There are always business people involved. But I think it's interesting to see it as a contact point when there's like business consulting and this idea of kind of optimization of of work, optimization of your processes, whether in a factory or in an architecture company or something else. And yeah, in a way, kind of like the kind of world of design and the world of kind of so-called cultural practice. So basically, this is a recent report when they try to kind of take on the kind of building industry and to kind of solve their problems, or again to eliminate the waste, right? To make sure that we are building more efficiently, we save more money, and things just go more kind of more smoothly, right? So they're smoothing things out. Whether it's and if you look at their work, if you look at what McKinsey does, they are in every industry from government to oil and gas, to architecture and construction. So what they are proposing is to kind of reshape regulation, to rethink the contracts in this case, and also very interestingly to rethink design. And that's and for another time we could discuss what do they mean by that, and also to infuse architecture with technology and innovation. So in a way, there's this kind of all these ideas how to kind of make what we do, or in a way what architecture does, kind of more efficient, more smooth, more compliant to the market. And in a way, and there's a lot of pressure, and this is just one example, but if you really look at the kind of overall landscape, there's a lot of pressure for architecture to kind of perform in accordance to some kind of like financial metrics more and more. You can see that, especially early, like in 70s and 80s, when there was this like wave of financialization happening, there was this kind of a push to kind of expand the field of expertise for large practices at that time to kind of really focus on speculative developments, things that maybe won't ever be built, but still bring in profit both domestically and abroad. And I think maybe introduction of BIM in architecture is one of the kind of late technological consequences of this managerial turn. But of course, it's also about kind of more general kind of shift of infusion of technology and kind of maybe kind of entrepreneurial thinking in practice. So in this context, my exhibition, or my part of the exhibition, deals with exploring the kind of managerial turn in architecture during the kind of onset of the current immaterial economy, and to kind of try to build and draw or represent artifacts of, let's say, some kind of post-avant-garde, post-2008 maybe architecture practice. And in a way, there are like three things that I made. In a way, when I started this work, there was an idea that I could try to kind of speculate about some alternative models and things, how things could work differently. I think that it's a complex matter in a way, and what I discovered is that probably kind of like a really kind of a brutal intensification of the existing situation maybe is probably the first step of greater understanding them better, and I really kind of chose to stick to that in the project. So the first part of the or the first of the three items is the kind of series of drawings. But basically, they're all flowchart drawings, trying to kind of indicate or map the various transformations that have taken place in relation to architectural practice over the last decades. So, for instance, it's the transformation from architecture corporation to AEC firm, transformation from architecture to the architecture of the market, transformation from commodity to spectacle, transformation from architectural modernity to post-architectural modernity, and so on. So in a way, each of those drawings is in a way based on a text. So a text that has been important in the project, and then 6 of those drawings are in a way kind of like semi-subjective representations of those texts, but I also can try to kind of convey some other kind of organizational meaning of those ideas. All right. So the second part of my project is a prototype for a flexible working desk. So if you recall the kind of like experiments on prototypes and efficient furniture, this is basically a kind of a prototype of a flexible working desk. It is designed to be kind of low cost and high speed solution to the question of kind of flexible workspace. So the base of this desk is basically a prefabricated kind of aluminum system that can be basically kind of adjusted to different configurations. And the top part is kind of laminated a single kind of, or sorry, it's double plywood plate. And it's all kind of held together by these shock absorbers that are supposed to kind of mitigate any kind of unexpected turbulences in the process. So the table has no permanent fixtures, and it can be assembled and disassembled in about 30 minutes or maybe up to 45 minutes. So in 30 minutes, you can basically turn it into like pile of aluminum, rubber, and a sheet of plywood. Basically, this is useful for the kind of potential changes in the amount of workers in an architectural office. So in a way, it could be like basically disassembled and stored or maybe deployed very quickly. This table can also be moved very easily around the workspace. This is quite helpful to kind of achieve maximum kind of flexibility for teamwork, collaboration, and all kinds of like global market turbulences that might require an immediate rearrangement of the kind of productive capacity of an architecture office. So as you see in a video, it takes like 2 fingers to move the whole table. So it's very smooth in its operation. And finally, there's a rig for a video game. So the biggest part of my fellowship was a video game, which effectively was a simulation. And this is kind of a custom-made rig to kind of contain all the equipment and the game controllers, all in a kind of same piece. Is built out of the same materials that the kind of that the overall table and all the other pieces of the exhibition. And this is how it looks like when you are playing the video games. So the kind of rig is oriented towards a large kind of projection screen. So it kind of like almost like immersive kind of reality situation. So the video game is basically a kind of a stroll through a hypothetical lean architectural office. I started working on this game pre-COVID isolation era. But this kind of idea of immersive reality already back then seemed to be very relevant, especially when thinking how to represent a somewhat elusive topic of management of architectural practice, something that is in a way kind of intangible. So I thought to kind of really use the visual language of a kind of digital walkthrough experience. It's something that is commonly used by architects to kind of represent their future projects that may or may not materialize. In this case, it's a real-time 3D game environment that you can experience either in VR or on like a 2D screen to basically just stroll through and just to kind of experience the kind of like hyper managerial office. So as you see, some people are resting. The work never ceases. It's a 24-hour operation. In a way, you could say this is the most efficient office space. It's somewhat cozy, friendly, hip, perfectly measured and productive. But at the same time, it's also messy. There are errors and glitches. So as the global market fluctuates, so does this workspace. Some of the office furniture is sleek, elegant, and perfectly functional. But occasionally, there are other pieces that make no sense. It almost seems as if in the kind of effort of making things perfectly functional and smooth, some weird and unusable kind of permutations arose. So it's almost as if like this function was the kind of ultimate state of functionality for this kind of organization. This environment is built as a non-game, which means that there are no structured goals, objectives, and challenges. So you as a player, you kind of wander through the office space, just observing its operations, observing its performance, and just imagining like, what could be the kind of productive output of this place? Maybe none. So this is my last slide, and this is probably one of my favorite kind of images from the kind of exhibition process. It shows the space one day before being finished. Basically, it's there are two things I want to say with this image in a way. I see that very much my fellowship project is still in progress, and tonight was only like we managed to glance kind of over it. I think one of the lingering questions might be what comes next, or what are the alternatives, or what else could be done with architecture. It's not something that I have prepared for tonight, but I'm currently teaching a studio which is dealing with the kind of issue of how to decommission architecture, how to unbuild architecture. And in a way, and there's really amazing work done by my students. So I feel that, and I hope that I could share this with you at some other time, but basically, because it's still in progress, but basically, I think the idea of unbuilding or slowing things down, or kind of like almost trying to reverse what we do in architecture by taking things apart and almost like reducing the kind of global amount of square feet might be one way to really think of like fundamental alternatives to this kind of like ever expanding managerial practice. So I think that that's very important to note. And second of all, I think that in general, it's important that I think in today's age that in general we explore more and more kind of possibilities of immaterial 3D environments and ways of constructing kind of nonlinear narratives. And I think that in general, the kind of virtual and kind of non-game environments is something that I think us as architects and as also non-architects who probably are watching is something that we should kind of embrace. That's it from me. So I will pass on the stage to Jacob.
Okay, great. Just sharing my things now. Okay. So, thanks, Matis. First, as Matis did as well, I just want to give a quick bunch of thanks. Still so bizarre that this is happening in this way, but I'm glad nonetheless that whoever is here is here. It means a lot to all of us that you guys are taking the time during these crazy times. So again, to the fellowship committee and Sharon for providing me with the opportunity to teach and collaborate with students and the fabulous community of faculty and staff to make things for this exhibition. To Kelly Moore and the facilities team and everyone at the annex for letting us squat in their space. To Laura Brown for answering literally any question. Well, I mean, I should thank on behalf of all of us, probably all of us, for thanking Laura Brown for everything that we've ever asked for. To my students who have helped expand my understanding of co-working, co-living, and furniture design. A huge thanks to assistants and friends Christian Austin, Eli Back, Adrian DiCorrado, Ziwan Lee, Laura Lisbona, Chris Humphrey, Sangwan Ji, and Dan Ray Zhang for their intellect, talent, and commitment to seeing this project through. To my fellows, Matis and Eduardo, whose inspiring work has greatly shaped my own. And as always, to Ingrid Lau for her relentless skepticism and unconditional support. So I hope you all like the stuff. So first, a bit of background to contextualize the work, with the caveat that much of this thinking was done pre-COVID-19. So the future of co-working and co-living, as well as any future job prospects that I might have, is much less certain than it was just a few months ago. But assuming that eventually things will continue more or less in the way they were, major US cities will continue to see increases in co-working and co-living spaces resulting from rising real estate values, urban migration, and digital nomadism. An incoming generation of itinerant professionals find these companies' low-risk rental and subscription models, various amenities, and tight-knit communities desirable, as they provide conditions otherwise unattainable rather, as individual renters. So this fellowship capitalizes on financial strategies of major co-working and co-living companies that lease office space, perform interior fit outs with patented equipment, furniture, technology, and amenities, and sublease that space for profit. These companies produce total environments by way of what they call the, quote, space as service model. Environments equipped not only with desks, conference rooms, and coffee bars, but also with an invisible set of protocols which facilitate the politics, organizational structures, and management of people in space. It's also worth mentioning the burgeoning furniture rental industry is a key influence in my own work. One startup of particular interest, Geometry, a subsidiary to its parent co-working company, Notel, supplies Notel's users with modular furniture equipment subscriptions they need to do their job. So for instance, you can rent a desk or a conference room for a monthly fee. So it's kind of one-stop shop, which incorporates the design of furniture and co-working into one. So this model very much serves as a springboard for the way I've conceived of the work I've done over the course of the fellowship. And I think it's also worth mentioning why architects, I think, should care about furniture, or why I care about furniture anyway. So oftentimes architects treat smaller than building scale, i.e. jewelry, tea sets, furniture, pavilions, as an ideological or technological testing ground for an eventually building scale proposal. So think Felix Candela concrete pavilions, or Peter Eisenman's rings, or Greg Lynn's tea towers, or his ravioli chair, Werner Patton's Visiona projects, etc. The work I'm doing sidesteps this, opting instead to adopt a practice more closely related to that of a furniture or industrial designer, monetizing and reproducing the pavilion scaled equipment within the realm of co-working and co-living. The argument for serialized furniture is also one about agency. At a time when profit-driven real estate schemes increasingly tightened regulations, BIM standards, and the mass production of building components have rendered the architect increasingly powerless in the production of the built environment. This research and design proposes there's an opportunity to learn from these companies' modes of operation, which nimbly adapt to socioeconomic conditions and produce architecture at scale. A close friend and colleague told me earlier last year that it's punk to get paid. And while initially skeptical, I've since leaned into the statement. So if I become a neoliberal hack, it's your fault, Lida. So the work on display is a proposal for a readily deployable series of discrete architectural objects, which can be assembled, disassembled, and transported with ease, unbound by typical building regulations and costing a fraction of ground-up building. As previously stated, the project operates somewhere between the space of architecture, industrial design, and furniture design. A soft architecture produced not in units of one, but many, an itinerant serialized catalog of equipment. So there's a model of practice being proposed in my fellowship work, but there's also designed objects. I made things. That is to say, people can adopt the method that I'm talking about, the method of practice, but the outcome could look very different, as it does with something like geometry. Much of the actual content of my design work is a critique on traditional domestic architecture. So think single family homes, apartment complexes, things we're most familiar with. Their socially isolating features, strict programmatic delineations, and wasteful redundancies in utilities, furniture, and equipment. So in lieu of those, the fellowship work proposes a world where the only private property owned is a 9x6x12 living capsule, and all other pieces of equipment are shared across the entire community. The capsule, I'm going to talk about the pieces. So the capsule, conceived of as a perforated thick gauge powder coated steel structure, has a thick base allowing for storage of bedding and other personal items. That thick base also doubles as a seat or a porch, depending on the configuration of the units. The unit contains foldable storage racks, accordion doors, sound and light-proof curtains, and built-in ambient ceiling lighting. These easily movable sleeping units accommodate a variety of configurations, ranging from informal clustered arrangements to more structured rigid grids, accommodating a variety of domestic settings and or preferences. And in any successful cooperative, certain responsibilities are divided amongst members of the community. And each piece of equipment designed always has this in mind. So for example, with this table, the tabletop thickness allows for the storage of shared plates, bowls, glasses, and silverware to be washed and restocked by a member of the community. Each piece of equipment anticipates a, quote, space as service model, one which is meant to work in tandem with the protocols inherent in any successfully governed collective. And as a kind of formal and material cousin of the table, the kitchen and its equipment, oven, dishwasher, etc., wasn't so much reimagined as it was condensed into a thick line and formed into a freestanding object. The kitchen is double-sided or mirrored with an overhead illumination system whose vertical structural elements allow for the hanging of shared cookware on a steel mesh grid, as you can see. The next couple of pieces deal with storage, display, and spatial division. So something my students and I over the course of this last semester have learned, and in hindsight of the kind of open floor plan office system, in hindsight it's kind of obvious, is that people like barriers for privacy and sound blocking and all kinds of things. They like their private space. So the promise of the completely open office is a false one, I think. And so something important in this design project was to always have that in mind and be thinking about ways in which space could be divided, not by, more conventional party wall systems, but by objects, still movable objects. So the above wooden piece that you're seeing above the black model, for instance, is a thick porous storage wall with space for public display, as well as hidden storage contained within pull drawers. In addition to storing and displaying things, it acts as a partition wall, which helps to subdivide the space with regards to both privacy and program. And it's worth noting that all of the pieces that I'm showing are basically one thing that does many things. So this storage wall, again, has the capacity to provide a threshold to divide one space from another, to store things, and to display objects. So maybe it's a good time now to take a step back to look at another object that was designed over the course of the semester and built. The display cabinet system that you're seeing, the wood boxes with the green fabric. In the exhibition that you kind of are seeing, it's holding all of the models of the other pieces. The idea is that it's able to kind of put in a co-working or co-living situation, it's able to be a storage space for, books or whatever people want to put inside. It can be a display cabinet for art or whatever. As modules, the pieces are able to connect to one another via green ripstop fabric and zipper connection. This is the kind of situation, by the way, that I was really happy with McLean saying that not everything had to make sense. So going to the fabric store and just buying ripstop fabric and zippers was very liberating, and knowing that I had institutional support to do that was wonderful. So there it is. There's wooden boxes connected with green ripstop fabric and zippers. Here's another orientation of that same cabinet system, a U-shaped arrangement in a different setting, forming a more distinct interior and exterior condition. So if here it's about a kind of zigzag where either side is, easily accessible, this one is about a kind of understanding of a clear moment of intimacy. And just a quick shot of the back, so you can really see that it privileges one side. So the piece has rotating panels, which allow for 3 different orientations to store and or display things, as well as deep cabinets that you can see at the bottom, which provide structural support and hidden storage space. So next, with any co-living or co-working space, you need a toilet. So this is that. It plugs into existing building infrastructure. And again, it's important to reiterate the point that all of this is meant to be understood as being inserted into existing buildings rather than ground up construction, for all the reasons I listed before. The cylindrical toilet shower unit contains a sliding door leading to a shower head above with adjacent toilet and sink. Storage compartments for shared robes, towels, and slippers occupy the thickness of the walls. Robes, towels, and other pieces of clothing can be washed using the laundry system, which is diagrammatically similar to the kitchen in that it's a thick line with mirrored storage, folding space, and washer dryers on either side. And the piece is meant to serve 10 to 12 units. So as, again, to cut down on that kind of excessive redundancy of utilities and free up space for life and work. So this image is an instance where all pieces of equipment are aggregated into a single space. The units are placed in various orientations, as I was talking about earlier. So some are more kind of informal. The green zone, for instance, has a kind of like, presumably people who knew each other would live there, but there's also a kind of gridded arrangement for others. And those are broken up by storage and display walls and infilled with kitchens, dining areas, and workspaces. And the toilet and toilet/shower units serve as 8 units each, which are the red bottom left and top right. So again, it's a sort of like something important with this project also is competing with, because all of these are conceived of as being in dense, expensive cities, something important is to compete with the density of, like a competitive co-working environment or company. So maintaining a kind of square footage per person is important in this project for me. So there's Eduardo playing The Sims. And he has very good posture, so he kind of looks like a sim, which is great. So the incorporation of, so something I did, this was at Montis's fault because he started making video games. So one of the most popular video games of all time, just by number of copies purchased, probably most of you have either know it or have seen it or have played it. For 20 years, The Sims has been a vehicle for gamers to realize their kind of ultimate domesticity. They can have power over the smallest details. And while the game has grown more politically progressive since its release in 2000, its architectural offerings are still very orthodox. So you'll be able to see it now. So through playing and modding The Sims, I found the ways in which The Sims programmers understood object affordances to be largely in line with something like the architect's Neufert catalog. The same types of presumptions privileging able-bodied, heteronormative people of a certain literal stature. And that it's quite difficult within the confines of amateur modding, like what I'm doing, to alter this. So, or to kind of alter these presuppositions about the way that furniture ought to be used. So in a word, it was kind of difficult to do this. This is like a comedic relief for people who are feeling sad in their homes right now. So within my system of equipment, there are often confused sims, strange approximations of conventional furniture uses, and all kinds of glitches where the sims are trying in vain to use the equipment that might be foreign to them. And I think using video games, like Matis kind of spoke to this a little bit, but it's a useful kind of democratic tool or mode of representation for architects, in that most people play them, and there are built-in simulated personalities and customizable characters which viewer users can empathize with. And I think it really, even watching it on video is very different than, because obviously the hope is that visitors of the gallery would be able to play it, because I think it really is a unique way of experiencing kind of architectural work, whatever it is. So let's see. Okay, so, and the last image I want to leave you with is simulated people having a party, eating and dancing around the table in a not socially distanced manner, which I wish we could have had together. But I appreciate very much you all, or whoever is here, joining our digital exhibition. And I hope you've brought your own drinks or whatever you like. So thanks so much. And I'll pass it on to Eduardo.
Should I? Cool. Thank you. Thanks, Jacob, for yeah, I do have a good posture. Anyways, hello everyone. This is Eduardo Mediero. I'm the Fishman Fellow here at Taubman College. And I also need to start with a few thanks. Many of the people that I want to thank have already been thanked, so I'll keep it short and just mention an amazing team of people without whom all of this would not have been possible. Mackenzie Anderson, Lindsay Barranco, Jamie Lee, and Victor Martikian. But also, it's not only special to be the first Fishman Fellow, but to share this experience and opportunity with Robert himself has been really amazing. So I'd like to personally thank Robert Fishman for his support and generosity, because I'm really, really, truly grateful. Okay, so let's jump into it. On October 10th of 2019, the annual report on global commercial real estate investment activity published by the firm Cushman & Wakefield displayed one major anomaly. Foreign real estate investment in the city of Madrid had increased 202% in just 1 year, the highest rise ever registered in this classification, as Madrid leapt from a 19th place in 2018 to now 4th, just behind global financial capitals like New York, London, and Paris. Among investors and public administrators, reason that such exponential growth is derived from Madrid's attractive cultural offerings and financial stability. A more complex reality underlies these narratives. In a city where the belief in private property is thought to be an inalienable right, and property laws hold personal gain over public interest, Madrid's hyperaccumulation should not be a shock to anyone. To fully understand the consequences that private property has had in the city of Madrid, we must take into account various circumstances that are most of the times overlooked. Its historical character, constantly in evolution, its fictional nature, and more importantly, its ideological background. By understanding that the claim of property is a subjective construct rather than a given definition, one can start to comprehend the extent of its influence and start to challenge it. And while the argument has been made that property per se goes as far back as several millennia in the establishment of agrarian societies during the Bronze Age, it is not until the 1st century in ancient Rome that it acquired legal definition. In the year 161, Roman jurist Gaius threw some light over the discussion regarding property rights over public and private goods in his treatise Institutes. Gaius made two main distinctions: things that were subject to private ownership and able to be sold, the res in commercium, and those that pertain to the public realm and thus insusceptible of being traded, the res extra commercium. And while this distinction may seem trivial, it does define the fundamental basis of private property, which is its ability to grant economic value to a good by virtue of its limited nature. For Gaius, the trade of private goods was only focused on material corporeal entities, physical things, the res corporale. Only what could be seen, weighed, and touched was adequate for exchange and therefore speculation. Incorporeal entities such as contracts, usufructs, or obligations were hence subject of non-economic value. And this is a distinction that has been carried to this very first day, to today. However, with the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s and the subsequent deregulation and privatization of capital markets, we have witnessed a soaring competition for goods, many now immaterial, that of course Gaius was unable to consider, right? In the last few decades, financial capitalism has generated new unprecedented immaterial assets that have challenged the ability of property laws to establish clear boundaries. Lands, buildings, and objects now have been replaced by bonds, derivatives, and stocks, sets of goods that are not only unperceivable, but also limitless. An infinite financial structure that is unable to accommodate the never-ending hyperaccumulation that neoliberal economies are generating. However, investment assets of financial capitalism require a certain degree of liquidity, this is, of available capital, in order to operate at a certain sort of scale of buying, selling, and investing. So real estate as an immovable good is, historically speaking, the quintessential illiquid asset. As Matthew Souls points out, lands, buildings, and units are expensive, they're large, they require maintenance, they tend to be highly idiosyncratic in time and space, and they're situated within complex and nuanced socio-political contexts, which basically makes them very time-consuming to buy and sell. The financialization of the built environment overcame this limitation through the manufacturing of financial instruments that provided a high degree of liquidity and speed global economies were craving. Financial instruments such as real estate investment trusts or subprime mortgages, or even here to the right, the Abacus 2007 AC1 model that Goldman Sachs came out with, were sort of models that operated as liquid intermediaries for property ownership. And while these instruments increased the amount of architecture, of production of architecture through the insatiable aim of urbanization, there was also a clear effort in increasing, sort of in defining the design of the built environment through the production of a series of physical financial formations, whereas Souls defines the urbanization of capital. So when looking at our cities and the repercussions that finance capitalism's reliance on property has had on our built environments, the mere notion of the urban must be brought into question. While many will define the urban condition as an interconnected movement of goods, people, and ideas, its foundational core is based in the application of private property as a tool for control. To understand the urban as the abstraction of processes of efficiency and control is to acknowledge its capability for economic profit as the sole reason for its existence, and pretty much the whole entire premise of this research. Ross Exo-Adams also adds that the urban is an invention, a technology that operates the spatial union of private property and circulation, and that therefore it is legible and reproducible, a category radically opposed to the idea of the city or of the polis. So the notion of urbanization, this is the self-expansion of the urban, a term attributed to Spanish engineer Ildefonso Cerdá, attempts to enclose a particular expression of power through spatial orders in which, as Adams states, the idea of circulation is crucial for giving order to the physical world, as well as making legible the forms of power that ruled over it. But while for Cerdá, circulation implied the provision of services, goods, and people through a formless network of roads, rails, and pipes, today, with the financialization of the urban environment, circulation acquires a slightly different meaning, as now it's fictional capital in the form of financial instruments what is being moved around. The urban has now become the arena of neoliberalism's capitalist expansion. So, unlike the city or the polis, the term urban or urbs implies an a priori conception of the city. This is, if the polis was a result of adjoining individuals into a community that recognize themselves as such, the urbs is constituted from the top down, right? It's generic status foreign to the rules of place and time. And while the polis was specific, spontaneous, unbounded, the urbs is generic, deliberate, and limitless. The urbs and its subsequent historical mutations, the suburbs, the exurbs, the transurbs, the neo-urbs, and so on, came to designate a universal and generic condition of cohabitation in service of finance capitalism. So today, as real estate markets value continue to rise towards another catastrophic collapse, it is crucial to push for a city model where the exchange value of goods is rendered insignificant or even irrelevant. To push for an understanding of the city as far away from the term urbs as possible, that which is not urban, or what I call the non-urbs, thus becomes not only an oppositional counterforce, but a social responsibility for those committed in defending the common over private interest. Against the infinite totalitarian character of the urbs, the non-urbs present itself as an isolated and delimited. It is tangible, material, and bounded, a constellation of individual enclosed objects, independent but highly interconnected. The non-urbs is not an alternative, but a resistance. The non-urbs is a city within the city. So this non-urbs is constructed of a series of sort of an aggregation of a series of financial formations, 4 of which I will be explaining today. The exhibition apartment, the advertising ad, the unproductive factory, and the stock interchange. These 4 provocations depart from the conventions of contemporary financial instruments and offer an alternative post-property scenario in which the circulation of capital is rendered irrelevant. Credit swaps, synthetic collateralized debt obligations, and alternative derivatives are put into use through what could be considered hyperbolic realities that evidence the deficiencies of a system in service of personal profit and exploitation. These complex abstract systems are represented through a series of diagrams that exemplify the possibility of translating its immaterial presence into a quantifiable medium. Within an urban space, increasingly governed by financial capital and its algorithms, the challenge presented was to translate the abstract into the materialized spaces of our daily lives. This process derived into a series of physical financial formations that increase the available liquidity of the markets upon achieving greater ease and speed of its transactions. Or put in other words, build forms that are created to be generators of capital. So let's go through these 4. The exhibition apartment, the first one, it's a classic spatial product of real estate, right? We all know it. It allows buyers to imagine themselves in the physical space, sort of a physical one-to-one model, while permitting developers initial minimal investments. So this first financial formation departs from the use of credit swaps to create a shared ownership scheme in which the asset is infinitely swapped to constantly increase its value. The excess of capital is then extracted into a co-op that runs the whole structure. And the project sort of formally takes the penthouse of one of Madrid's latest luxury developments, La Gasca 99, as the one and only residential unit of the project, a unit to be collectively owned, but never occupied. The advertising ad bases its existence in the reciprocal income of capital through self-promotion. A series of time-based bonds are literally stacked on top of each other to shield the shares from the volatility of the markets. And these bonds are sort of materialized into a vertical office structure that is able to generate profit by simply advertising itself. The unproductive factory erases the labor struggle in the production of goods, a defining characteristic of its sort of original predecessor, and creates a system that no longer introduces into the market material assets, but immaterial ones. Through 3 interspersed stages, bonds are created and simultaneously stored, while investors are able to swap them in order to generate profit while waiting for the bonds to get introduced into the market. The materialization of such a system derives into an empty storage space in which the slanted profile of the ceiling questions the representational value that build form inevitably carries. And the last one, the stock interchange, is probably the most ubiquitous representation of the abstract sort of circulatory decree of the markets. And this financial formation subverts the conventional trade services of what we know as stock exchange buildings to create a closed system of CDOs, or collateral debt obligations, that are constantly repackaged and introduced back into the system. The material result is a centralized network that contains the physical infrastructure that holds itself, along with a grandiose trade hall that is a symbolic space that no longer needs to be used. So these are sort of the 4 financial formations that sort of exemplify or represent this idea of the non-NURBS. And this was sort of part of like the work that I've been doing for the last few months. But in parallel to that, I worked into a call for proposals, a sort of call for proposals that invited 8 architecture practices from around the world to participate in sort of a given brief that challenged the contemporary claim of private property over architecture, and that asked sort of the participants to imagine the design possibilities that its illumination could provide. And the call included various sort of offices and individuals, from Alexis Bertoni from New York City, Casablanca from Mexico, Guillermo and Cristina from Australia, Yuki and Noam from LA, Matilde Casani from Milan, Luis Callejas and Charlotte Hansen from Colombia, Parasite 2.0 from Brussels, and Studio Vatten from Norway. And the participants were mailed a short essay and brief that asked them to consider the manual property or public domain as a trigger for alternative modes of cohabitation in a possible urban environment. The proposals consisted in the design of a single room, a room that was asked to be totally generic by being absolutely specific. The room was not to be considered as a part of a domestic realm, but rather a spatial prop of a larger system in which the appropriation of architecture through private property is superseded by inalienable communal protocols. And these proposals were materialized into 8 18 by 18 inch physical models that were actually built here at Taubman College, and was also they were part of this journal exhibition along with a series of texts that each participant wrote to explain the projects, that were sort of varied in form, from essays to poems to letters or even manifestos. And it was really incredible to see the sort of varied responses that all these sort of projects had in response to the same brief, right? Some participants took the call as an opportunity to explore sort of planetary scales, from Luis Callejas and Charlotte Hansen's Observatory, a room to contemplate the last place where private property does not exist, space, or Guillermo Fernández Abascal and Cristina De Lucci's Earth Room, a proposal that seeks new ways of belonging to Earth by exposing its own composition. Other participants looked into the appropriation and storage of goods to evidence the limitations of property, and some of these projects we can even like relate back to Jacob's work. From Matilde Casani's Hypebeast Blocker, a public piece of furniture storing goods for a totally shared economy, or Yuki and Noam's Station, a spiraling store infrastructure that provides all sort of miscellaneous set of objects. And moreover, many ideas also of law and capital were sort of explored in these projects. Here, Alexis Bertoni's work that looked into the displacement of homeless encampments through luxury residential developments in Oakland, California, or even Studio Vatten's The Property Courtroom, a staged ruin that materializes the production of laws and civil codes into actual physical space. Sort of theater that could perfectly be related back to sort of the suburban scenography that Parasite 2.0 submitted, or even the playful Mexican toy of Casablanca. So and this was sort of like all the sort of proposals that the participants submitted. So maybe to conclude this whole spiel and to end here, I'd say that in a time where the free floating of capital and speculation continues to shape our built environments, the unprofitable dimension of the non-NURBS may provide possible solutions to this derail. To bring the horizontal egalitarian principles of the public realm, of the common, into individual pursuits may allow once and for all a system where private financial interest is taken over by common use. Thank you. And now we are going to bring into the call a few of the faculty here at Taubman College for a sort of panel discussion. And we sort of invite you guys, everyone, to submit questions or comments, as we will we'll be able to sort of answer them here in real time, along with Irene, Laida, and Ana Paula.
So we have 3 questions already. So maybe before we start the discussion, we should respond to the questions.
We have 3 questions. Wow.
Yeah.
I haven't seen these.
So in the YouTube chat box.
Oh.
So first one is by Kaya Ramirez, who asks, "What is a managerial hallucination?" And
That's
I think it's good to extend it a bit. So maybe we can describe what is a managerial hallucination, but also what is a financial formation and so on. So maybe each of us could try to answer that question.
Yeah. Do you want to
So,
take managerial hallucination to start?
yeah, so I think managerial hallucination is some kind of experience of, in kind of involving some kind of apparent perception of necessity that is not really there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have the easy one here. Domestic simulation. I was literally using The Sims to simulate domesticity with the objects that were designed over the course of the year. So I was thinking about using kind of AI and the biases that are built into any AI to kind of go head to head with the stuff that we, my students and I had designed over the course of the year.
And yeah, if I were to explain very briefly what these sort of financial formations were, this idea of the financial formations almost came from the sort of the premise of form follows finance, where you actually can trace physical built form that responds to specific financial instruments and ownership models. And while the ones that I presented almost had a sort of very provocative sort of condition, we actually in our everyday lives we live in financial formations, and one of them could be, like, probably most common of all, the condominium, right? It's sort of vertical stacking of individual ownership to sort of repackage and intensify the amount of sort of charitable assets in one lot, for example, right? So they are sort of everywhere, and it's interesting to sort of look into architectural and urban form through again through finance, and actually be able to trace these trends.
Okay, so we have a few more questions. I don't want to delay the kind of discussion, but I think it's good to kind of cover them so everyone is kind of on the same page about what we did. So the next question is from Jonathan Massey, who asks, "What is the technique of highlighting?" And I guess it's meant highlighting the comment on YouTube. Well, I can tell that happens when you are the streamer of the video, when you're the author of the video, then it just automatically highlights you. But maybe there's some deeper meaning in it, and I think maybe we should go contemplate that a bit more. Okay, so then there's a question from Mick McConnell asking, "Are all of the texts on site digital too?" No, they are not, but maybe we can discuss and try to kind of publish them soon. And then we have a question from Angie Roberts Zeltzer asking, "Given the COVID situation, would you have approached your fellowship differently had you known what situation we would be in today?" Maybe a quick idea. What would you do?
Well, it kind of corresponds to the other question by Daham. Could you all speak on your experiences translating your projects from physical to digital presentation this month? I don't know if I would. Well, actually, I probably would have changed a few things if I had a bit more time to think about the implications of coronavirus on co-working and co-living. I may have given that a second thought, but that probably would have had to come like last year before my fellowship presentation. But I think now that we've done it, and kind of to Daham's question of translating the projects, I think it's just awkward, and I think you have to have fun with it and realize that everybody's in the same bizarre and uncertain situation. And maintain a kind of, I know this is like cheesy, but kind of maintain a positivity and just be excited about 133 people giving you support when you have them. So I think it's great.
Cool. So why don't we invite our three guests to join the conversation. Ana Paula, Laida, and Irene. They are around.
Yeah, they're coming. There they are.
Hello.
Hi. Oh, there we go.
Cool.
I kind of have a question right off the bat. I think maybe in some ways my question is most directly for Jacob, but I think in some way it's for everybody. Well, first of all, I want to say huge congrats. You're kind of redefining how this is done with like whatever, like, you know, such grace and skill that it's already a new way of doing this period, a really exciting and you know, potentially a keeper. So I want to super congratulate you all on that. So you all design and kind of propose circumstances of architecture produced like not in units, but through either many objects or circumstances that produce a kind of proliferation. So where one thing times many times is either architecture or becomes of an architectural scale. So in this way, we've known IKEA, UPS, Walmart, like all of these things to like become part of the conversation of architecture recently in a highlighted way. So in this model, scale is not like vertically defined, or it's not defined by like the size of the infrastructure that creates it. Say like the practice, even potentially the size of the practice can be separate from its ability to proliferate. So what's the can we just essentially just like, rather than placing it as a question, can we talk about the multiplier effect if in our relationship to the multiplier, like, is there something as like pedagogues or practitioners that there's a kind of new skill set involved in this format of being people that present one instance of a thing to the agency, to the agent that has the ability to multiply it? Is there a new client typology involved? And is that exciting or not? Or is there a new skill set involved? We can all chat. Irene, I'm sure you have a lot to say about this too.
Jacob, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a big, so I think it's kind of, for me, it's like the question of like how to think about more nimble practice that also
Nimble, yeah.
can be prolific in its output. So like, it's not about like big scale, literal like buildings or cities. It's about small objects and pairing with, that's kind of the idea, right? I shouldn't do that. That's kind of the idea of thinking about co-working. Co-working is a sort of alibi just to think about an industry that allows for the designs of one to be, you know, like propagated ad nauseum. You know, so like this is kind of the agency question too for me, is like, where does the reclamation of agency to be a little over the top for architects come today? And I think one place I hope is in this realm where it's thinking about, yeah, like reproducibility and seriality rather than like the one-off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a different kind of answer to that, but it's also I did a different project in a way. Although I agree with what Jacob said. And it's kind of really weird to talk about proliferation in today's situation.
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Multiplier effect, yeah.
Yeah, no, but that's like a personal note. I think, and I will relate it to like idea of like alternative practices. I think that we are living in a very interesting moment, and in a way, I mean, I'm young or old enough to remember 2008 because that's when I started studying, and basically my first year of undergrad was like 2008 collapse of everything, collapse of architecture, collapse of architecture, collapse of economy. And in a way, after that, what happened is that there was this massive kind of interest in all kinds of alternatives, ideas of like reinventing the system, rethinking also what architects do, and so on. And there were a number of publications trying to survey all kinds of other practices that kind of manage that could potentially be the kind of other ways of doing things. And you can still see those books in a library. They are a bit kind of worn out, but if you look at today's situation, like none of those things have picked up, and or most of those things have not picked up. And I think it's because of some kind of, there's always, I think that, again, sorry for the reference, but I think it's kind of on point that same as the coronavirus, you need to kind of several things to coincide to make the thing like really proliferate. In this case, like a multiple kind of, I don't know, kind of genetic mutations that kind of produces this thing, and I think the same way kind of works in if we think of some really kind of other ways of doing things. Yes, there are many localized examples when people have managed to reinvent the way that they practice, but these things are not always, sorry for the kind of managerial term, scalable for all kinds of externalities. And I think that I don't want to be kind of pessimistic about it, but I think that maybe it takes way more time to kind of perfect and kind of like ideate the right thing that you want to proliferate, and then try to kind of deploy it on bigger scale than just to do it kind of impulsively. If that gives some kind of response to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I were to jump into sort of the scale question, I think which is, at least in my project, extremely important, right? Because as I was mentioning, understanding of sort of architecture in the built environment as a sort of financial asset has always sort of existed at some point, like even from the very beginning, I don't know, from Roman times, sort of speculative understanding of the built environment is, at some level or not, it's been there. But it's actually, as I was saying, it's the moment that it sort of everything explodes and acquires like a humongous sort of global scale from like the 1980s onwards, when things sort of get out of sort of question. I don't know. It's so maybe the critique maybe would have been the problems not understanding of architecture or the built environment as sort of financial asset, but the fact that it has such a sort of big repercussion, right? Which even in my project, again, as the sort of this idea of the no-NURBS, it can be a replacement, right? It has to be a sort of a resistance. If like the no-NURBS became the norm, then it would become precisely, like if it scaled up to, again, planetary scale, then it would be all wrong, right? So it always requires a certain sort of almost, again, damn, I have the word, but like, I don't want to use it, but like, yeah, sort of like viral sort of quality to it, right? That requires of the existing structures of our sort of economic systems to be able to exist. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Oh, wait. Let's 1 second, Irene.
I muted and then unmuted myself.
Yeah.
I can work the mute button. I had a question. I think I'm really curious what maybe you guys have, what thoughts you guys have on riffing about neoliberalism. I feel like it really factors in so heavily in all of your work, and you've mentioned it as a kind of as a fully accepted system that is fully ingrained within at least much of the culture and societies within which your projects take place and your research is taking place. But for me, I'm really curious about, like I'm looking at my notes here, but where is morality within all of that, right? Eduardo, you just referred to kind of the scale change. Lida was talking, like answering Lida's question, but where is morality in all of these things, and where is our responsibility in terms of architecture for inserting that? And then again, I guess the second part of my question is, where's the agency in that, right? What are some myths about the existing power or agency or importance of architecture that, Matis, you really pointed out in 2008, a lot of those existing tropes or existing myths that we have about our own profession really collapsed. So, you guys really attacked this at so many different scales, and it's so integrated into culture, but it's so integrated into the kind of manufacturing, the Industrial Revolution, the neoliberal capitalist ideas. We could even talk about it from Ayn Rand through Thatcher, through Reagan. So I'm just really curious, like, those things are really strong still, yet how do we objectify them? How do we get outside of them? How do we begin to affect them? So I'm just curious for you guys to riff on that.
Okay, can I? Okay, yeah, I think this is a good question. I mean, I don't want to go back to kind of my academic upbringing in the Netherlands, but I felt that at the time when I was there in TU Delft in 2012, no, later, 2014, I mean, at least in the kind of in many parts of the kind of many conversations, there was this whole discussion about neoliberalism, and I kind of very immediately got suspicious about those discussions because that term was, I don't know, I felt that, and I don't mean to kind of say that I didn't buy the concept, but let's say that there was very kind of like a preconditioned attitude towards what it is, and that it's something that like is evil, that is destroying us, and don't get me wrong, we are all victims of those policies in some way or another, and we know someone who has suffered or has been kind of like subjected to those policies, and the results are mixed, and there are many kind of problems with that. But I think that what we try to do with this, what I try to do is I think it's too easy to just take like a polemic position, to take a moral position, to say that this is horrible, let's resist it, let's make an alternative, and so on. I mean, I think that whenever someone, especially in academia, says that they are resisting neoliberalism, I get very suspicious, especially in American academia, when we know how this whole thing is financed. So I think we should be very careful with like our statements in that regard. And I don't mean to kind of criticize your question, but more in general. That I think that we should all accept that we are in this situation where it seems that there is no alternative, that we're all trapped into it, that we all have to face it, and that's true. But I think that we should almost like reinvent our terminology, reinvent our thinking, how we think about it, and maybe not even use the term neoliberalism, but really think, just try to generate other kind of ways of understanding of that, and other ways of like thinking how we could overcome that. Because I think just resisting, I mean, in that sense, probably the most radical act would be to do nothing, and if we really wanted to resist it, but then for how long can we do that? So, or maybe there's something else. But I think that, but at least let's say some kind of self-financed housing cooperatives, I don't think it's something, or some other kind of projects, I don't think that that's really a way to resist it. So I feel that this is what I mentioned, is that I think that maybe first step to come to terms with that is to kind of just try to kind of exaggerate it, at least in a discourse, just to kind of understand it better, and to really kind of exaggerate it to an extreme, not to accelerate, but to exaggerate it in our own projects, and maybe start from there. I know it's not a kind of hopeful or definite answer, but this is the best I can give.
Can we maybe pivot from that question to the question of agency? Because in some way, this like it is kind of like a clean definition of neoliberalism, or the clean version of itself, that kind of is constantly telling us that in some way it doesn't need us, that it would be more efficient without us, that it would be like more of this sort of yeah, the kind of like pristine chain system. Some of the critique that you had on the supply chain, but yet somehow here we are, like in like underlining some residual agency, or like, you know, poking at some kind of like agency, that whether it's managerial or whether it's through furniture or like property, like more like legal avenues, like highlighting our, you know, like picking our crumbs of agency, or maybe, you know, maybe crumbs times many times. It's like, it's not a crumb anymore. So, but it does seem like we are here sort of insisting on some certain kind of agency. And since Irene, you brought up the kind of second part of that question, I'm doubling down on that, if we can pivot.
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, this is kind of an impossible question, because I think like architecture and architects are, it's like the most complicit, you know. I mean, it's not the most, but it's like up there in terms of just how expensive it is, and its kind of sordid relationship with power and money. And so, like, to be a responsible citizen, it seems like the only thing you could actually do is quit architecture, like reasonably. Like, otherwise you're just like, you're gonna be complicit in one way or another. And for me anyway, I have no idea what the answer is, and where morality lies in that is I'm really glad you asked that, frankly, because that's not a question that's asked often. Somehow those things are, and you know, like, it's probably not a healthy answer, but I've largely thought of, I've created a pretty distinct barrier between my personal life and morality, and then work. Because as an architect and designer, like, I mean, there's probably certain clients, should I have the opportunity to design for, that I would not, if they were kind of morally suspect. But outside of that, like, it's a really difficult thing. And it's sort of, I agree with Matis in the sense that something, you know, like this kind of myth that that academia is somehow insulated from those same neoliberal forces is kind of not,
Yeah.
I don't buy it. And then then it's like, okay, so if that's not the case, and there isn't really a space of refuge, then how do we engage in some sort of like middling way, you know? Like, if there's no space for all out revolution, then, you know, maybe like small, like baby steps might help. So if you're not evil and you're an architect, maybe you can like both be moral and still have an impact at scale. And that's kind of the hope anyway, and why I'm thinking so much about kind of proliferation.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
tired of like the
If I were to maybe add to that briefly before you respond, Irene, I'd say that also sometimes refuge is sort of understood as a sort of actual like physical separation of the issue. I'm thinking of the sort of socialist utopias that would of Charles Fourier, who would like move to the countryside and start a completely new society because they were trying to sort of criticize the existing sort of whatever structures that they didn't agree with, right? And they always failed because that sort of refuge was trying to avoid the existing systems, right? And I think we can't avoid it. It's within us. It's around us. We have to sort of operate within the rules of the game, which that's absolutely inevitable. But we, as much as we can, we must use those rules of the game for the proper sort of benefits or for the proper sort of uses. So again, it's not about sort of isolation or completely sort of like separation, but actually sort of embracing this, the system in which you exist and work and produce, and sort of challenge it or sort of crack it, you know? That makes any sense.
Yeah, I was just really thinking, because I mean, the way you guys are framing the kind of scale, agency, and then neoliberalism sort of conversation is super interesting to me, and because I don't think I've ever thought of it as a binary argument, in that it's never good or bad, it's never neoliberalism or morality. It's not a zero-sum game for me. I think my question was more geared at just the kind of nuances of all of your guys' work, right? There's these nuances and these little moments of penetration, of infiltration into this kind of really you know, complex and layered systems, right? We're talking about economics, politics, social, cultural, all of these different things. And I think for me, in terms of the morality question, or in terms of just, you know, that relationship to neoliberalism, I guess I'm most interested in how your projects infiltrate, right? Infiltrate these existing systems. How do you see your work affecting or having some kind of chip in the armor, or doing something that really affects how architecture currently runs? Like, all of you guys have looked a lot, all three of you guys have really looked at, you know, these like really existing closed systems, right, that have been refined over decades and decades and years. And I guess, given the changing nature of our economy, given the changing nature of our labor, given the changing nature of our governments, where different governments are working with different, with the same companies. So like, even the way different governments are dealing with COVID, I think I'm just really curious where you guys see the opportunities for your work and for your thinking, you know, to build something, some kind of intention or inertia.
I would just jump into that and just make some observations. I enjoyed very much all your presentations, and I learned a lot. And my question, following on yours on opportunities for change or breakage, I was very curious about the human factor, or the subject of this architecture, right? I was fascinated by Machi's desks. The first desk with all the drawers, and the organization of those drawers for efficiency, and the pencil, and then the desk you build with nothing. And I was also very curious about the absence of cognitive studies, cognitive science, or human agents, or how the brain adapts to this. So as a PhD in anthropology, my colleagues in cog anthropology always had these jokes about the left brain desk and the right brain desk, and how human and personality, how could you tell about humanity and personality change based on the desk, right? And I think it's so interesting that this jump into the digital, the internet, everything, I mean, all that research is gone because everything is compacted on a virtual space, and the research doesn't keep up with the pace of moving. So in terms of architectural agency there and breakage, what is the limit of the human into trying to put the human, feeding the human into this logic of mobile? It made me think of my own research in Michigan, where all the migrant-run organizations run backpack offices, right? And the precarization, that my understanding of what an NGO should be, or how an NGO should operate, basically it is the precarization of all labor, right? That needs to be up and running and mobile, and what does that do to human agency? Now, regarding to Jacobs, I really liked your video game, and probably as the only non-architect person here, this is like a novelty for me, that you can put your ideas in a video game. And I think that it made me thinking through my planning capstones over the years here at Taubman College. So the way architects and planners that I worked with in Brazil works, that they are at the service of a housing movement or a shack dweller union, and they are their clients are these organizations, right? And convincing them of any alternative living arrangement or shared kitchens that would be more efficient, or bathrooms. And it's a non-starter conversation, right? And I just, in bringing into the video game into play, I thought it was very interesting. How can that, in a playful way, kind of change our imaginary of what is possible? Because of course, I wouldn't imagine to be possible to be 10 hours here today, sitting in front of this laptop, having all this meeting, but this, coronavirus thing made that happen. But another way is this playful way of the video game to play with human imagination. So I was just pushing to like understanding humanity and humans' capabilities and how we can use that to break with the system. And of course, the closest to my own work is Eduardo's work. I really liked your reading about co-ops versus condominiums and the legal structure that entails, right? So basically you left me thinking that there is a legal form that needs to follow the finance form or vice versa, and there is a physical form and a financial form, and how these things integrated, and where is the point, again, of breakage of the legal form, the financial form, and the building environment form. So I really like several of the examples that you provided. And I do think that these 4 typologies that you mentioned about financial formations are really basically the point where this will break, right? As you mentioned, if this extrapolates and becomes the norm, when is the point of a human revolution, but yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. I really enjoyed the 3 presentations. And Eduardo, I would love to talk with you more about all our civil codes and our legal propositions, because my capstone is precisely working on promoting and helping a social movement craft a new federal bill in Brazil that will install collective property. That is very different from this, of course, is very different from this exhibit apartment, right? It's in contrast. It's a type of co-housing and collective that is contra.
Thanks for your comments, Ana Paula. Great observations of the 3 projects. If I were to try to sort of tie in your comments and when also Irene was talking before, I'd say that, for example, more specifically in the work that I proposed, in sort of these sort of financial formations utilize the same instruments that I am criticizing, right? So in a way, by sort of exaggerating or subverting the systems that I simultaneously I am sort of criticizing, you're able to sort of evidence the sort of limits or the deficiencies of the system, while sort of simultaneously proposing sort of an alternative, right? So again, going back to almost to Irene's comment, again, it's not about sort of complete rejection, but sort of embracing the system to be able to sort of, I don't know, crack it or something, almost like a hacker of sorts, you know.
Yeah. I know there are so many kind of questions and interesting kind of provocations in your response that I'm not sure if I'm able to kind of respond to all of them, Anna. But I think that yeah, I mean, I think the question of where is the human in all this? I honestly, I don't know. I feel that just looking back at the kind of evolution of management theories in business in general, right? So if you start with, let's say, if we choose to start with Taylor and Taylorization, right? So workers are like basically like non-thinking beings, and they should be organized in a way that they perform the best way possible and need like very precise instructions, right? Then later, human relations theory comes in by Mary Parker Follett by trying to kind of say that humans are in the center and they should be kind of like nurtured to kind of like perform the best way possible. I feel that, and again, this is the interesting thing that like I don't think is different from any other company than an architecture company nowadays, especially those that are like not these boutique ateliers, but those who are operating in the market, building more or less things. I think that in a way, I think, yeah, I mean, everyone is kind of disposable, but at the same time, there is some kind of like willingness to make everyone as comfortable as possible, and but only in the name of performing as good as you can. And if you look at history of architectural practices, and maybe this goes back to Lida's question and also Irene's question, just to kind of wrap it as well, I feel that, you know, what are the other ways of like doing this? Where's the question of like morality, or how can we like find our own agency in this situation? I did a very superficial look at least in the US scene, in the kind of more or less large architectural companies, and you can look at example of TAC, which, you know, they try to be the architects kind of, you know, they try to kind of be collaborative. They tried to have a different model, and just purely in terms of facts, they went bankrupt at some points. And of course, I know there are a few people who might talk about it much better than I can tonight. But for me, this indicates that I think it's kind of difficult to just always kind of prioritize some kind of other ideals in the current system. And I think, to go back to the first question by Lida, I think that, I mean, yes, we should try to kind of imagine scalable things. We should try to imagine things that could scale up and proliferate and produce a difference. But I think that there are so many external circumstances that are involved in that it's just about right place, right time, and it's almost beyond our ability to fully kind of ensure that this happens, or that we could imagine some other ways. However, I think that precisely maybe one way to find our agency, or one way to kind of do things in our own terms, is to precisely do things that do not make sense, or do, in a way, our fellowship, again, granted by a very kind of like comfortable financial cushion for us, so we could do these things. But besides that, we could do things that are like not performatively measured, things that cannot be commodified. I mean, these things cannot be measured. Like, okay, maybe you can sell my table for $500, but that's it. Like, you cannot, it has zero market value, at least what I've done. And I think maybe that's the kind of one of the ways to find our agency.
Maybe we just remove the guarantee part, which is maybe what we have to learn from this circumstance. No guarantees.
Yeah.
It could happen.
Irene was totally like, she was nodding a lot. She was really agreeing with that, Matthias.
Just maybe a quick.
Irene wants the table.
So do I, actually. I told him I would buy it.
We all want that table.
Yeah. Just a quick note. Thanks, Ana Paula, for the comments. And I guess I'm going to try and thread the needle of the two, like the how do you make a chink in the armor question with where do people exist question. And I think the way that I would try and answer that is the chink in the armor, I guess, is, for me, it's first understanding the players who are most prolific in the kind of production of architecture. Like, how are they doing it? Even if you think they're the kind of bane of your existence, whatever, you have to kind of know your enemy, I think. And this is something I'm really interested in, and why I'm kind of looking at co-working and co-living. Not that they're my enemy necessarily, but they're very prolific, right? And obviously they have their problems, and even more so now. but yeah, that's true. I'm looking at the chats also, but so that's super important for me to just kind of familiarize myself with that, because I think if, like Eduardo is saying, if there's any sort of maybe this is too pessimistic, but in so far, if there, what I believe is that if there's any sort of capacity for change that architects can enact, it requires being a cog in a way in this very complex financial set of circumstances that we find ourselves in. So then where people come in, so like this is why it may or may not have come through in the presentation, but where people come in is if the first part of my presentation is largely about understanding the ways in which co-living and co-working companies operate at scale, then the second part is about, okay, if we operate in those same ways, but rethink what is being proliferated, the objects that are being placed into existing office buildings, and think about the implications of those things, because what these companies are doing is largely orthodox, right? It's not like a co-living or co-working space is different than your home most of the time, except to say that there are just more of the same things beside each other. So, you know, like, this is why I think something like furniture design is super important, is because the affordances of furniture and the way in which all kinds of assumptions are built into the way we sleep next to one another, the way that we sit next to one another, those things have real political, like I believe in the political consequences of a rectangular dining table versus a circular one, right? Like that's real, you know, one is a hierarchy, one doesn't. And maybe that's as much as architects can do, but I think that that's a big thing, right? Like, so this is the kind of threading the needle. It's like chink in the armor equals knowing your enemy, people equals having a progressive political position. Maybe that's all bullshit, I don't know, but that's the hope anyway. That's.
Well, you guys, we have voices. We have, I mean, I'm just like, you know, it goes beyond the object. I think that's what I see as like the real promise of your guys' work. It's not just in the object or the output, right? It's like, I feel like architects draw limits around where the agency of their work lies and all the time. And, you know, I bet Ana Paula has this less in terms of, you know, what planning does, but architects, we constantly are drawing limits around our own work because we contain it to the object. We price it within the object, we charge our fees within the object. I mean, and based on the kind of like real efficiencies and gains we've made in terms of industrialization and like the way our societies have progressed, you know, I'm so into this exhibition and your guys' research because I really feel like the people that see this, the people that you share this with, they can take more than the object. Even though I want that desk and the little squishy things, like you can really, you know, you guys can move beyond the object and the things you're dealing with, like just spill out. So, I mean, that's where I see the real strength in it. So.
Thank you. Thanks. This is very, very encouraging for me, at least. I hope for other people also. Are there any concluding remarks?
I have a question to that point. I know we don't want to drag this on too long, but I guess I would ask you if you would elaborate just on the idea, because I agree completely that in a way the sort of individual object is like incidental and is constantly changing, and to limit ourselves to the object proper is kind of silly or ineffectual. But I would then ask, like, what model of practice would you point to and set of behaviors would you point to, like, that exist beyond the sort of realm of the object proper?
That's what I was asking about the multiplier, 100%. What is this new model that the client typology? Irene, tell us.
Lila, tell us.
Ana Paula, tell us.
Ana Paula, tell us. That's your guys' work. You're supposed to tell us what these new models are, or at least point us in the direction. I think that, like, you know, I was typing to you guys in the notes that, you know, you were talking about players and And just like where agency lies, like to me, that is really at the crux of like what's happening in our profession and what has been happening in our profession. But again, it isn't contained within us. It isn't contained within our discipline, and it's not contained in the things we make. And I'm going to riff on that a little bit, Jacob, what you said. I really think the object is actually really important because it is still an embodiment. It is the memorialization of a thought process, of a kind of critical thinking and making that I think is really crucial to what architects do. You know, we jockey between abstract and we jockey between concrete. We jockey between like the immediate and the very far away. And so I think our ability to do that is really amazing. And again, to kind of answer this challenge, like where is that new model? You know, I would say it's with you guys. And like, again, that's probably cheesy. Like we're having a lot of these like, you know, cheesy moments, but but I think it's in how we frame what we do and why it matters. And again, I know that's really stupid and maybe it's not stupid, but it's really simplifying the process. But I think people connect with that when you're able to simplify it on those terms, right? Because again, there are, I think the people that do it well are people that are able to accumulate a lot of different objects around an intention or some kind of engagement with the world that they're proposing, right? And so if we look at a commercial example of that, I would say Apple, right? They're like hugely successful in packaging. And I know it's just a marketing ploy, but like think different. It packages everything from computers to software, to movies, to television, to payment software, how we use money, like that we don't use cash anymore. I mean, all of that's being affected by a company like Apple. And I do think architects in general, like when you start thinking outside of, you know, I've always loved Laura Kurgan's project, you know, the $1 million blocks. And it, you know, maybe it's not necessarily true, but linking sort of imprisonment with the kind of localities of how people were raised on their blocks and the kind of infrastructures and monetary support that they had at that level. Again, I think where we're able to make those connections with things we make the connections with the ideas that we have and the observations we have about like, and I say this a lot in my class, but defects and deficiencies in our existing systems, I think those then get transformed into opportunities. And from the safety of academia, which is an awesome place, I think we have the opportunity to propose, or at least like push things a little bit in a different direction. And then I would say from the, you know, the trenches of practice, that's where you really can get like very up close and personal with those deficiencies and with those defects, right? So I think all of us have the luxury of being able to kind of jockey between those two realms, especially I know because, and I'm speaking of the three of you, you guys, you know, definitely have a strong interest in practice, you know, beyond simply, you know, transitioning from practice into academia. But, you know, I myself played the hokey pokey, and I think it really is, it's a really interesting place to be in, and we can do that. So, you know.
Yeah, maybe to add into that, I'd say precisely to be able to sort of take opportunity or chance of the deficiencies of the system, you have to understand the system. Like, and you have to understand that there is a system, right? That there are, and that's precisely the ethos of this whole exhibition, immaterial protocols that govern the production of these, what we're calling objects, right? Sort of the physical sort of representation, the material representation of all of these things, right? And I think that's something that sort of has come across all of our work, the three of us, that we sort of acknowledge that all of these, say, spatial products, whatever they are, offices, living furniture, buildings, whatever, or cities, they always depart from a immaterial sort of abstract system that you have to at least understand. And that I'd say that tying almost to that sort of question of morality, it's our obligation as architects today to understand and those systems and include them as part of our sort of expertise, you know.
And it's not natural for our profession to do that because, as you know, Jacob mentioned, it's really like we're fully ingrained and fully enmeshed in these, and your work as well, Eduardo, is that we're fully enmeshed in these economic systems and efficiencies that are not subject to moral concerns, right? And again, what is the place of architecture, right? What is the place of our profession? Are we charged with a morality or are we not? Like, is it our job to do that? Is it, you know, what is our social responsibility? And again, you know, I think that really is a question of our, you know, that also challenges our own privilege and our own relationship to the work and the and the discipline and the profession and how we are able to do it. So, I mean, I'm so curious how you guys are moving through all that. So
We'll have to
on
figure
that note, yeah, sorry. Are there any other concluding remarks?
I just want to say thanks to you three so much for coming.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Mhm.
We
And
appreciate
you're,
it
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
it's
This
really
is-
a pleasure, and we really appreciate it. The thumbs up and all. Yeah, it's great.
Not even. Always wishing that these kinds of things could have a
yeah,
more seamless, you know, yeah,
yeah.
this could be more seamless so that the conversation could be somewhat like, just keep
Yeah.
at it
Yeah.
for a-
Thank you.
for a
Thank you
while.
so much.
We should do like a later conversation after this conversation to kind of follow up on this conversation in a way. I feel.
Yeah.
Can we email each other? No, I'm kidding.
I invite all of you to kind of stick around because we have like one last question from the chat box on YouTube from our viewers, and I think it's a long one. But I think it's kind of a interesting one, and it's a nice way to kind of wrap this up. So I'm not going to read the whole question because it's quite long. But basically, long story short, you know, we have our own kind of like values, and USA has like values of regarding how one is to live and what is the kind of normative way of living. And then at the same time, you know, quite often large shifts in behavior and values can only occur slowly or a result of some kind of like large scale cataclysm. So the question is, you know, what model do you imagine could change the kind of situation or like change the kind of perception of what's the normative idea of living in the US?
What model do you imagine will cause this change? I think that I don't think that the model would cause a change. I think that the model responds to a change. I think that's there's, again, you have to, going back to the whole sort of conversation we've been having, you sort of have to respond to sort of the rules of the game of whatever the systems are sort of offering you and work with that. The idea that a complete new model could sort of revamp everything, sort of that sort of positivistic sort of attitude, it's something that I think we're sort of agreeing here that is not the solution.
Well, maybe it's also a question to everyone present at this stage. I mean, maybe to make it more kind of provocative, like, do you think that the kind of current situation in which we find ourselves in globally would kind of produce some kind of maybe new sense of collectivity and some kind of change of perception of how we should live in general? Or you think it's just gonna fade?
I mean, I guess I'm of the belief that the sort of current crises is only surfacing existing crises. It's not necessarily sort of creating new ones. They were underlining to begin with, and they're just now highlighted. And I don't know. I can't really tell what it's going to produce. I think it's going to produce probably a new class system, probably a more divided one. And within those two class systems, there will be some new sort of like modes of living. I don't know what collectivity will look like, especially when you incorporate a kind of digital consideration where physical togetherness might not be as encouraged or easy. That part I don't really know, but I think it will create clustering, perhaps, rather than collectivity. I would maybe put that as a polemic, clustering versus collectivity, potentially.
Yeah, I would say it's totally up for grabs. And I just have a quick anecdote about that, which is, you know, I've got like 3 weeks of toilet paper left, and I'm pretty excited about that. And I just want you to know that I was talking to my neighbor down the street, and she had a gigantic pack of Costco toilet paper, and she left a six roll pack for me, which is really generous. Whereas, you know, when I went to the hardware store where I thought I was kind of gaming the system a couple weeks ago, they'd already sold out of toilet paper, but I thought that was a good place to go. But, you know, they're telling me that there are people buying like 80, 90 packs of toilet paper, which is enough for, you know, a year and a half of that. So I think Lida's answer is really, it illustrates or it kind of personifies just how up for grabs all of that is. You know, I think the hope is that it has some sort of effect like World War I, where, you know, everyone is banded against the enemy, right? But because people now can find community in such different ways, you know, and there's such a multitude of different opinions and different ways of slicing a particular fact or event into so many different ways, you know, I think that's the kind of new multiplicity that we're dealing with that is so complex. It almost is beyond like our more concrete, less abstract thinking, our kind of, you know, older biological selves. So I don't know, I think it's a great question. And I you know.
I also think that the kind of presentation the three of you did today, understanding the system and how the system works, is very important at the moment, because our sentiment is just to take care of the immediate humanitarian need that this is caused. But thinking, you know, keeping in mind the systemic failures of healthcare, the systemic failures of housing, of the financialization of these processes, and the exploitation of labor, precarization of labor is super important, because I think it will be in our memories forever that we had this time and that things happened, like $1,200 checks for everyone, no one gets evicted. So I think these acts will ingrain in our collective memory as possibilities of relief, as possibilities of what the state can do, but also our failures are more evident than ever before, the failures of our health system, of our lack of coordination. So I would hope that for the three of you that are fellows that focus so much on revealing to us how the system works, and I learned a lot from your presentations, I think that this is more needed than ever, so we don't get caught into, you know, the immediate need, but we can think more systemically in ways that we can, that this can impact us in the long run, can change things in the long run.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a very beautiful kind of conclusion, very hopeful conclusion. I hope, and yeah. I just wanted to. I guess I think it's time to wrap up this session. Thanks to everyone who was watching us on YouTube, and thanks for all the questions. I hope we covered all of them, and we really appreciate your response. This was definitely an experiment, and we, a few months ago, we intended this night to go on in a very different way that it did tonight. But nonetheless, I'm so happy that Ana Paula, Irene, and Lida could join us, and we could all come together, even in this kind of like decentralized way, to talk about the project and ideas. And I also really hope that sooner or later we can all meet again in person and just talk about this or whatever else, because it's always a pleasure. Yeah, so thanks again to everyone. Thanks again to McLean. Thanks again to Taubman College for this.
Thank you. All around. Hopefully you can eventually see the show. It's yeah. It'll be
Yeah,
fun.
the show's gonna be there. The material representation of the show is there, and hopefully one day you'll be able to walk into it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the effort and for your time. It's been really amazing.
Yeah.
Congratulations, guys. It was amazing. Thanks for making sure we were able to experience it, if not in full life, at least, you know, in the best way you guys could deliver it. And that takes a lot. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The best. You killed it, my friends.
Bye. Thanks.
Good night. Ciao, ciao. Bye. Oh, bye. Sad. So sad.
Hmm.
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 The only one staying. Wait.
Let's just stay.
We're just gonna like hang on to the end because we're too sad to leave.
Damn, Mathis is the host. If Mathis is gone, it's just like anarchy now. Like,
I don't know. He looks like he's still
TV
there. His
came
face
up.
is still on there.
I think that's Mattis's CV.
Oh wait, this should be like the outtakes. We could like do something. It's
Yeah.
like the end of the movie.
This is the director's cut.
I feel like I would be like Adam Sandler or something in this.
Anyways,
you.
cool.
It was fun.
Bye.
All right.
Talk soon. Bye bye.
Good night.